This discussion explores the historical significance of Hofner guitars in the development of Jamaican popular music during the 1960s. It details the technical specifications of a Hofner 176 model, which in the UK was marketed as a Galaxie, but it also considers the accessibility of these instruments in the UK compared to American brands, and their pivotal role in defining the rocksteady sound of Jamaica through legendary players such as Lyn Tait and Hux Brown. Hofner was a popular German manufacturer of instruments in post-World War II Europe, which established a dominant presence in that market but also pre-independent Jamaica through Hofner's UK distributor Selma. The brand is often characterized as offering lower budget instruments that borrow design features from popular American instruments of the period. But Hofner also added interesting interpretations to these features and designs, which now make the instruments distinct and increasingly collectible. The main attraction of Hofners for Europeans in the 1950s and 1960s was their affordability and availability. For example, the Hofner Galaxie cost about £60 in 1964, whereas a Fender Stratocaster, if you could find one, which the design of the Galaxie appears to be based on, cost closer to £150. In 2026, that converts to £1,700 versus £3,900 respectively. The narratives provided by many British guitar icons of the 1960s was that their first guitar was a Hofner, but most players transitioned to Gibsons, Gretsch's or Fenders after turning professional. Paul McCartney is perhaps the most famous player of a Hofner who continued to use the instrument throughout his career, but this is not typical. It's easy to assume that Hofner instruments were inferior to their American counterparts, but the fact is that most young British guitarists of the period were inspired by players such as Chet Atkins, Les Paul, Scotty Moore, Chuck Berry or Muddy Waters, who as Americans all played Gretsch's, Gibsons and Fenders. Is it possible that Hofners were not the second-tier instruments that many players, including myself, came to think of them as? Arguably, the two most important Jamaican guitar players of the 1960s, Lyn Tait and Hux Brown, question this assertion and support the idea of taking a closer look at Hofners and what made them distinct. Both Tait and Brown used Hofner solid-body guitars on the most iconic rocksteady sound recordings of the 1960s and some early reggae. I am not comparing Tait and Brown to the iconic guitar players who emerged from the British blues revival in the 1960s, because the electric guitar in Jamaican popular music served a specific function that was typically rhythmic or single-line and hook-driven, and this approach was distinct to other emerging popular music forms. However, the contributions of Tait and Brown are important in the story of the guitar, and it might be better to think of them as part of a guitar playing tradition in the mold of great rhythm players such as Steve Cropper, Malcolm Young, Catfish Collins or Nile Rodgers. The fact remains that both Tait and Brown played on a wide range of important Jamaican popular music during the 1960s that had a significant international impact, and their instrument of choice was a Hofner. The rocksteady and reggae hits that emerged under the influence of these two players include the Paragons' The Tide is High, Desmond Decker's 007, Israelites, and You Can Get It If You Really Want, Alton Ellis's Girl I've Got a Date, Jimmy Cliff's The Harder They Come and Wonderful World, Beautiful People, Toots and the Maytals' Pressure Drop, 5446, That's My Number, and Monkey Man, and Prince Buster's Judge Dredd. Brown also played on Paul Simon's Mother and Child Reunion with his signature rattle guitar part, with Wallace Wilson playing the rhythm part. The above compositions were all major international hits, but represent only the tip of an iceberg in the session guitar recordings of these two players. It's fair to say that Lyn Tait and Hux Brown contributed significantly to the development of Jamaican popular music and its international impact. Evidence of this can be seen in the way that Jamaican music inspired a new generation of pop musicians in the USA and UK in the 1970s and 1980s. Groups such as Culture Club, Blondie, The Police, The Clash, and The Specials all have connections to Jamaican popular music. Their influences are likely to have included some of the above sound recordings and the guitar work of Tait and Brown on their Hofner Supermodel or Hofner Galaxie, respectively. I suspect that the same is true of iconic sound recordings such as Hotel California by the Eagles and Babylon Sisters by Steely Dan, to name a few, whose writers and arrangers wittingly or unwittingly injected Jamaican musical flavors into their creative works. It therefore appears that both Tait and Brown saw their Hofner solid body guitars not as a budget alternative to a Fender, but a technical hybrid instrument that offered a specific tonal palette essential to the birth of rocksteady. And according to Tait, this German-made instrument became an inseparable part of Jamaica's musical heritage. My interest in Hofner guitars stems from a conversation I had with Tait in the mid-2000s when he was preparing to visit Jamaica from his home in Canada, and I offered to provide him with a guitar while he was here and assumed that he would ask for a Gibson, Fender, or perhaps a PRS. To my surprise, Tait asked if I had any Hofners, which of course I did not. And when I asked, why do you want a Hofner, he went on to explain how these instruments provided the definitive sound of rocksteady. This information surprised me because, like many kids growing up in the UK, my first electric guitar had been a Hofner. And when I was about 13, I became the proud owner of a well-worn Galaxie that I found in a pawn shop for £25. However, all the guitars I listened to played Gibsons or Fenders, and so by the time I was 15, I eagerly traded that Galaxie for an older Gibson 335 because that was what I could afford, and most importantly, that is what players like Alvin Lee, Eric Clapton, and Dave Edmunds played. At that time, the mystique of old vintage Gibsons and Fenders had not yet become established, and so the 64 335 that I acquired was simply half the price of a new guitar. Having worked as a professional musician in Jamaica since 1981, I rarely saw Hofners being used, and although I knew of Tait and Brown and their use of Hofners, I incorrectly assumed that this was out of necessity rather than choice, but that was not the case. After my conversation with Tait, I started looking for a Hofner to buy and decided to look for a Galaxie as used by Brown, and I was curious to see if my early recollections of playing this model still held true. The guitar I bought, which is shown here, came from Germany and is a 176 Solid Deluxe, which is basically a Galaxie with the addition of a 5-way tone switch. So let's consider the basic differences between a Hofner Galaxie and a Fender Strat. From a modern perspective, the Galaxie might be seen as an odd collection of ideas blending a Stratocaster-shaped body but reduced emphasis on the body contours, with a fat 50s Gibson-style C-shaped neck profile made from maple and rosewood. The fingerboard radius is 7.25 on the Galaxie, like contemporary Fenders, but the Galaxie uses a 24.25-inch scale length, which is significantly shorter than the Stratocaster's 25.5 and closer to the Fender short-scale guitars of the period, such as the Fender Jaguar with a 24-inch scale. Some commentators attribute the Jaguar's association with the clean sounds of surf music to its percussive attack, which in part comes from its scale length. I'm not sure to what extent this is true, but both Tait and Brown use clean sounds for the vast majority of their recorded works, and perhaps this was in part what made the Hofner attractive for use in Jamaican music. From a player's perspective, one of the most noticeable differences between a Hofner and a Fender is the height of the fingerboard in relation to the body of the guitar, and as a result the pickups and bridge sit relatively high on the top surface of the guitar, whereas the fingerboard of both Fenders and Gibsons are much closer in height to the top of the guitar's body. For this reason, the right-hand playing position on the Hofner feels more like what one would expect from a hollow jazz box with a floating bridge. The body of the Galaxie is thin compared to the Strat and perhaps closer to the body thickness of an SG of the period. The Hofner features a bound fingerboard, which is also similar to early Jaguars, but employs a distinct bar-type fingerboard position marker and a 2-ply PVC overlay on the headstock, which seems to be a feature of the higher-end spec Hofner guitar models. This particular example has a Fender-style string tree on the first and second string, which I've seen on other examples of the model, but it is not in the catalogue pictures and may be a modification of the previous owner. The Galaxie features 3 Novasonic humbucking pickups, which are perhaps closest in design to Gibson or Epiphone mini humbuckers of the period. Each pickup employs visible pole pieces with one coil using adjustable screws to allow the balance of the strings to be adjusted. Each pickup is controlled by an individual on-off switch rather than the Stratocaster's 3-way selector switch, and this allows for a diverse range of tonal combinations, which the Stratocaster could not easily replicate. In the 1960s, Strat players would try and catch their 3-way switch between the bridge and middle and neck pickup in order to use them in combination, and which eventually led to the introduction of the 5-way switch. But there was still no way to use the neck and bridge pickup in combination, or all 3 pickups together. However, the Galaxie could routinely accomplish this. I'm not sure if Hofner was the first company to offer this switch in layout on a 3-pickup guitar, but the idea is also found on the Fender Jaguar, which uses on-off switches for its 2 pickups. And the design was later used by David Schechter, who in the late 1970s built a range of super strats that employ this feature, famously used by Mark Knopfler and others. In the 1990s, Wayne Charvel and Eric Galetta also used this design on their WRC Neptune series of guitars, which in my view had some clear benefits for playing Jamaican popular music. For example, playing rhythmic patterns sometimes result in the Strat's pickup selector switch being hit and changed unintentionally. I endorsed for WRC in the 1990s, and in addition to it being a really nice boutique Strat-inspired guitar, the switch layout was flexible, and other Jamaican music style players like David Elixiri Jr. from Steel Pulse can also be seen using one of the new Galetta guitars with this same switching option. In case anybody is wondering about the finish of this guitar, WRC developed a process of adhering mother of pearl and abalone to the wooden guitar body, which is not only aesthetically pleasing, but it provides a durable and hard-wearing finishes that influences the tonal quality of the instrument. Going back to the Galaxie, the master volume control sits next to the pickup's on and off switches, and like the 3 tone controls, is laid out in a radio-style console type of rotary control, which is also found on early Fender Jaguars. While this design is aesthetically pleasing, for some styles of music, this type of control layout might be considered impractical. The Galaxie's volume control is more difficult to use than a Strat if the player needs to create subtle changes in volume that the Strat allows for while the player's pick remains in contact with the strings. This is perhaps an often overlooked feature of the Strat that was exploited to great effect by players such as Jimi Hendrix, Rory Gallagher and Ritchie Blackmore. Gibson blues and rock players of the 1960s also created a similar method for controlling the guitar's dynamic by setting one pickup to a low volume setting and the other pickup to a full volume. The pickup selector switch then became one of the ways in which the player can instantly change volume by altering the switch position. I'm not sure to what extent Fender or Gibson planned for their respective control layouts of their 1950 guitars to be used in this way, but the design of the Fender Jaguar at the start of the 1960s tries to grapple with the growing need of guitarists to be able to change the guitar volume with the introduction of their dual circuitry control layout for rhythm and solo playing. Hofner also was clearly aware of this growing need for guitarists to control the guitar's dynamic, but their solution was in the form of a solo rhythm switch that provides approximately 6 dB of boost or cut. This suggests that Hofner was not only looking at the latest American developments in guitar design, but coming up with their own solutions in response to the needs of players. It's also important to keep in mind that the above guitars were designed in a period when a typical guitar rig consisted of a guitar, a cable, and an amplifier. No boost pedals or pedal boards to program the sound and dynamic changes for each song. It's not clear to what extent Hux Brown found the rhythm and solo switch on his Galaxie useful, particularly in live playing. But during this period, Jamaican guitar players were also not driving their amplifiers and then using the volume control to achieve a less distorted and clean rhythm sound. The typical sound that was expected of a Jamaican guitarist in the 1960s was limited to a clean sound that was used for rhythm, single line, and solo playing. In addition, there are some palm muting techniques that Tait and Brown specialized in, which became a characteristic of rocksteady. And for some players, the Stratocaster's volume control location may have impeded this style of playing and made the Hofner a preferable instrument for rocksteady. Other notable features of the Galaxie include a rotary spoke wheel type truss rod adjuster located at the heel of the neck, allowing for truss rod adjustments to be made while the strings remain under tension and without the need for a special tool. This makes the fine-tuning of neck relief on a Hofner relatively easy to achieve compared to Fenders of the period. Credit for this design is often attributed to the Ernie Ball Music Man design team from 1987, but the Hofner design predates it by over 20 years. This particular 176 model, like the Galaxie and early Fender Jaguars, also featured a mechanical muting mechanism on the bridge, which I am yet to find a recorded example of in Jamaican popular music during the 1960s. I find that when the mute is engaged on this instrument, it slightly alters the intonation of the strings, and so I'm not sure of how and when, or if it was ever used, but perhaps it was intended as a marketing gimmick, or perhaps this bridge mechanism needs some form of adjustment. There's no indication that Brown used the mechanism for the style of muting that characterized his playing, and based on the testimony of musicians who worked with him, his muted guitar sound was a combination of left and right hand damping, which can be heard on Alton Ellis's Girl I've Got a Date or Paul Simon's Mother and Child Reunion. When Brown plays these muted figures, he injects a fast rhythmic emphasis on some notes, which seems to have inspired the local name for this style of playing as a rattled guitar part. On this particular 176, it is fairly easy to engage the damper unintentionally, which can be annoying. But this instrument is over 60 years old, and perhaps the spring has weakened, or my right hand technique is just too heavy and used to playing on standard bridges without a muting mechanism. The bridge on this type of Hofner is fairly complex, but appears to be well engineered. The main frame for the bridge carries two sets of roller bearings seen here, which the upper section of the bridge that holds the string saddles then sits on top of, and it can be adjusted slightly by sliding it back and forth and is held in place with two screws. The string saddles are made from a hard plastic or nylon type of material, and transfer of the string vibration goes through the saddle frame, the roller bearing and main bridge frame into the bridge height adjustment screws, which is very different to Fender and Gibson designs. But to what extent this influences the guitar's sound is hard to quantify. One downside of this type of bridge is that the string tension has to be reduced in order to adjust the saddle for correct intonation, and although the 60-year-old bridge still functions well, I assume that this is because it received regular lubrication and maintenance. The tremolo system is a fairly simple design based on a single spring and is very much in line with the Bigsby design intended for a light Hank Marvin, the Venturas, or Burt Whedon type of whammy bar usage that was really a vibrato. Other features worth mentioning include the use of a PVC vinyl alligator skin covering that is glued to the wooden body and uses PVC piping on this particular instrument. My recollection of the Galaxie I owned in the UK was that the body was covered in a glossy PVC material that was very hard wearing and difficult to damage unless you took a blowtorch to it. On this particular example, the body covering has stood the test of time well, and it is still in great condition for an instrument that was mass-produced in the mid-1960s. This instrument, as the 176 Solid Deluxe model, also has a passive 5-way treble and bass switch. This seems to act like a progressive, low-frequency cut switch and is similar in concept to the Gibson Veritone found on an ES345. But the Hofner design uses a simpler circuit of capacitors rather than the inductor circuit found on the Gibson. Another small but important detail is that the electrical components seem to be good quality parts that are all original on this instrument and are fully functional. All the internal wiring consists of screened cables, and like 60s Fenders, the components are mounted and screened by thin brass sheets that are grounded to avoid unwanted hum. Whereas Strats were particularly sensitive to picking up unwanted hum, the Hofner by comparison should be a much cleaner sounding instrument with this level of screening and use of humbucking pickups. My overall impression of this instrument is that it is well made, and while using American guitars for inspiration, Hofner applied an independent engineering and design approach to the features of the instrument, which make it fairly unique, and despite its looks, it is definitely not a Strat copy. It is perhaps closest in concept to the Fender Jaguar, but takes inspiration from other instruments, including the Stratocaster. Given the dominance of American popular music in the 20th century and its predominant use of American guitars, it is perhaps not surprising that many of the resulting guitar playing styles and sounds that emerged in the 1950s and 1960s were in part a product of the idiosyncrasies of these American instruments. To Hofner's credit, while using American instruments for inspiration, they followed their own design philosophy as represented by the 176 here, and this might be considered a strength, but also a weakness. In my view, a Hofner Galaxie would never be a great substitute for a Strat if trying to play rock and blues of the late 1960s, even though the instruments are visually similar. However, if these instruments are assessed on their own merits, as clearly done by Lyn Tait and Hux Brown, they represented an ideal choice of guitar for a style of guitar playing and sound production that was unique and well suited to rocksteady and reggae. The moral of this story is perhaps the realization that as guitarists, the sounds and lines we create are as much driven by the instruments we play as the creativity we try to inject into the music we perform. And this becomes more apparent as you try to develop your own sound rather than copy and replicate the sound of others, which is where every guitar player's musical journey starts. I hope that this short visit to the guitars and music of Lyn Tait and Hux Brown has not only highlighted their respective achievements as players and musical creators, but also how they adapted and adopted Hofner guitars to meet the changing needs of Jamaican music, and as such they played an indelible part in the development of rocksteady and reggae.